these people together formed what I call the fascist troika, the fascist undercurrent that had been extant in the United States culture for some time, but had not risen to any sort of political prominence because, for the most part, radical religion, although practiced in the United States, was not really welcome at the highest levels. The separation of church and state was still at least nominally respected. And because of this, it was very difficult to profess open support for evangelical Christianity. And for Jews, it was difficult also, because until the 1967 war, Jewish Americans were very concerned that they might be considered somewhat less than true Americans if they harbored a dual allegiance to Israel. So for up until 1967, the Holocaust and other sorts of Zionist issues were kept very much out of the public view. They were very personal. They were not to be discussed. In fact, only 3 books on the subject existed until 1967. And then 1967 happened. Israel provoked a war in the Middle East and managed to seize control of the Suez. It occupied East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, Suez, the West Bank, Gaza Strip. It is still an illegal occupation of much of that territory today. But the fact that Israel did it meant that Israel was no longer some afterthought in U.S. policy, which was oil-based. Strictly speaking, the U.S. wanted the Middle East for oil. That's all they cared about. But Israel now was a major player. Because American Jews could now look upon Israel with pride because they conquered territory. They could now espouse both support for Israel and the United States, and so did Lyndon Johnson. And principally because Israel was one of the few countries that wouldn't give him grief over Vietnam. So by the time 1973 comes around, we have 3 groups of people: evangelical Christians, Jewish Zionists, and Straussian neoconservatives, neither one of which has any regard for America. What happened then, during this period, which was a reaction against the populism of the 60s, came to a particularly interesting end in 1976 with Jimmy Carter's victory over Gerald Ford, just by a squeaker. It was the narrowest victory since 1912. And that decision, defeating Gerald Ford, was, I believe, a decision by the United States public to turn its back on the Vietnam War, the cruelty, the sadism, the lies, the corruption, the violence perpetrated in the name of a misbegotten war, and turn their minds forward to look for something else. America wanted a new country, and Ford was a remnant of the old country, though a very good man. Carter was an evangelical Christian, a Baptist. He made it possible for Christians to come out from the closet, so to speak, and profess both a political and a religious identity. What Carter failed to understand, though, is that with respect to the Middle East, he was not there to represent the United States. He was there to represent, well, Israel. Because soon after he was elected, now I'm talking about 1977 March in Clinton, Massachusetts, he delivered a speech where he spoke honestly, intelligently, I think, about the need for a Palestinian homeland. Well, the Israel lobby basically had a collective heart attack. They assailed him, they slandered him, they libeled him, they attacked him vigorously. And Carter tried to backpedal out of this, saying, well, it's going to be a condominium with Jordan and all this stuff. But it was too late. The Israel lobby, which came to prominence under Harry Truman in 1948 and owed its allegiance to the Democratic Party, was for the first time considering supporting a Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan. Reagan himself came to power with really nothing upstairs except a good moral sense and an aw shucks attitude. He had little understanding of economics, no understanding of foreign policy, and basically made a devil's pact with Jack Kemp and certain what are called neocon supply-side economists that, yes, I'll implement your economic policy if you put me in office, if you support me. And so what happened with the election in 1980 was that the Zionists, both Christian and Jewish, and the neocons, came to power, and their front man was Ronald Reagan. And through the 1980s, we have a transition period. A transition period between the role of oil as the dominant influence and cause of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and that of supporting Israel, to the detriment of oil and to the detriment of the United States. Some of the most interesting things happened soon after Reagan took office. And this happened both in Lebanon, Iraq, and Palestine. Menachem Begin was head of Israel at the time, the first Likudnik head of Israel. And Reagan decided that he was going to assert himself as an American foreign policy expert. You know, I want certain things done. In June 1981, Israel bombed the Ozark nuclear power plant in Iraq. It did so illegally, using American weaponry, contrary to the U.S. Procurement Act, using U.S. satellite technology, contrary to U.S. law, and the United States did nothing about it. In September 1982, Reagan spoke of a Palestinian peace. And he, like every other president since Johnson, spoke against continued Israeli construction of illegal settlements. 4 days after Reagan made his speech, Begin humiliated Reagan, that's right, and promised $18.5 billion for new settlements. On September the 6th, 1982, Lebanon was under invasion by Israel. And Reagan saw pictures of bombed out cities and children burnt beyond recognition. And Reagan, for all of his faults, was a very moral man. He had a sense of humanity. And he told Reagan he had enough of this. He wanted to stop doing it. And all that Begin could do was throw up the Holocaust in his face and told Reagan to pound salt. Throughout the 1980s, Israel virtually ignored everything the United States wanted to do in the Middle East. It had carte blanche to do what it wanted. And from the 1980s onward, we see a progressive diminution of oil as the main interest of the U.S. Now, I want to say this because from 1932, say, until about 1979, U.S. oil policy was pretty predictable. You put a tyrant in charge. You tell him to repress the democratic rights of his people because, democratic societies provide for their people, and that cost, is factored into the cost of extracting the oil from the ground. America doesn't like paying much for its oil, it likes to get it real cheap. And so in case of Saudi Arabia and Iran under the Shah, which the U.S. installed over the wishes of the Iranian people, the U.S. had a very nicely contained supply of oil. Repressive regimes, cheap oil, loyal, everything's okay. Well, if you look at that particular oil policy, and we look at how Reagan and George W. Bush behaved, we see an incommensurability. For example, Reagan wanted to ensure a safe political climate for the oil in the Persian Gulf, with Saddam Hussein as head of Iraq. He sent Donald Rumsfeld to Iraq to shake Saddam Hussein's hand and assure him of U.S. support for a pipeline to be built to the port city of Aqaba. Of course, it was well known that Saddam Hussein at the time was using chemical and biological weapons in its war against Iran. It was well known, the Americans knew it. The Americans said nothing. Americans wanted oil, they wanted stability, they wanted a quiet economic climate. Flash forward to 2000-something or other. George W. Bush fabricates an implausible, untenable, farcical case against Saddam Hussein for having weapons of mass destruction in order to bomb the bejesus out of his country. Now, in 1991, Dick Cheney had acknowledged that there was no more threat of nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction from Saddam Hussein. Colin Powell said the same thing in 2000.